My name is Mark Warren. I live in Lumpkin County, Georgia, near Dahlonega, and I run a wilderness school there called Medicine Bow, in which I teach the survival skills of the Cherokee and nature classes. And I am an archer, and as I'm getting older now, I was a canoeist for a long time, but now I'm spending much of my time in writing, which has become a great love for me. I went to the University of Georgia and studied art for 2 years, and then changed my major to chemistry pre-med, finished up that way, thinking I might be a physician, but was swallowed up by other interests and knew I needed to be outside more throughout my career, so that's how I got where I am. What got me interested in this subject was something that I can't take any credit for, or nor can I give it to anyone else. I feel like I was just blessed to be born with a very aesthetic appreciation for nature. It just pleased me so much to be inside the forest on a visual level. I didn't know as a boy the things that I was seeing. I didn't know how to read a certain track and know what animal it was or what the animal was doing. I simply needed to be there and just kind of feel the heartbeat of it. And then when I got older, about college time, I developed a real hunger to find out all about the forest. And so that became, I actually entered that as a kind of a solo project after college, and I did a lot of good studying in college, but I didn't do nearly as much as I did later in the study of the forest, because it's one of those subjects that no one can ever learn at all. I continue to learn now. I think the most critical moment for me in my career, as I always thought of myself as an adventurer, just exploring, but I guess you'd call it as a naturalist now. It was this one experience I had of reading one book, and it was written by a lady whom I've never met. Her name was Sally Carragher. She wrote a series of books about different geographical places and what went on there through a day's time. So one book, for example, was called One Day at Teton Marsh. Another was One Day at Beetle Rock, and that was the first one I picked up. And it was written this way: a chapter was devoted to a mouse, and you went through an entire day with that mouse on that particular area, place called Beetle Rock. And during that chapter, a coyote entered the scene and became part of the story, and you were rooting for that mouse. You wanted that mouse to hide and be successful. Okay, that chapter comes to an end, and then you go to the next chapter, and it's all about the coyote. And now when you're reading about the coyote and his struggle to stay alive, when he comes to Beetle Rock and senses a mouse nearby, you want him to get that mouse. That was your mouse that you just loved in the last chapter. So there was something about the looking at nature through the eyes of the very thing you're looking at. And I remember that day later, I was reading a book about beaver. And I was trying to learn everything I could about beavers simply because they fascinated me. And I realized I was just filling my head with facts. And something about it got repulsive for a moment, and I slammed the book shut. And I went outside and I told myself, I'm going to learn something today, fresh and new on my own, that I've not read about before I go back inside. And I did. And that night, I followed that up with lying down in a canoe out in a marsh area, and I had an experience with beaver that night that I'd never had before. So that was a life changer for me, to slam that book shut and go out and remember to be experiential rather than erudite.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's evening lecture. My name is Trey Gaines, and we're glad to have you out here this evening to join us for our first evening lecture of 2024. How many of you came to Lunch and Learn last week? A couple of you did. So you came to the coldest Lunch and Learn we've ever had. Now tonight you're here at the wettest evening lecture we've ever had. So we're glad you came in for this event. While you're here tonight, I do want to invite you to see the rest of the museum. After the lecture, we have our temporary exhibit on the other side of the wall behind me on medical history here in Bartow County, which is why we have Mark here tonight to talk about medicine. And then upstairs, all of our permanent exhibits. So if you've not been before, I do encourage you to stick around a little while and check out the museum. We have a number of programs coming up in the next several months, and I encourage you to go online to our website or follow us on Facebook to get all kinds of information about those upcoming programs. We'd love to have you come back out again and join us. Well, let's go ahead and get started with our main event. I'm going to introduce our speaker. Mark Warren is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Georgia. At Medicine Bow, his nationally renowned Wilderson School, he teaches nature classes and primitive survival skills. In 1980, the National Wildlife Federation named him Georgia's Conservation Educator of the Year. In 1998, Mark became the U.S. national champion in whitewater canoeing, and in 1999, he won the World Championship longbow title. Mark has written extensively about nature for local and national magazines, and he has 15 traditionally published books. He has been honored by the Spur Awards, the Historical Novel Society, the Will Rogers Medallion Awards, the Peacemaker Awards, and most recently was the recipient of a 2022 Georgia Author of the Year Award for his book, Song of the Horseman. Please join me in welcoming Mark Warren.
Thank you very much. I hope you'll join with me today on this program and have this more than a lecture and just maybe a conversation. I welcome questions, so please interrupt me at any time you'd like to ask me. I was born in love with the forest, and there's no logic behind it at all genetically, because I didn't have any member of my family who cared anything about the outdoors other than, say, a golf course. And the most wilderness my family ever saw, besides me, was the rough in a golf course. But I was in love with the forest, there's no doubt about it, and I wanted to learn about it. Really didn't want to learn about it until about my college age. And until then, it was completely aesthetic. I mean, I felt like I was walking through a masterpiece painting every time I was in the forest. And I was being privileged to walk through that painting. And then, in college, I really wanted to start learning about my friends that I'd made, you know, the different trees and herbs. And I quickly learned that to really understand it, I needed to know what the people knew about it who first lived here, the Cherokees. They lived intimately with the forest. And today, now this is not everybody, but most Americans, I believe, kind of use nature as a backdrop, like a painting, to look at, and are not very involved with it. We're all completely involved with it, even though we may not realize it at the moment. I mean, a lot of you have paper in your hand right now, but it doesn't pop in your head that that's the heart and soul of a tree, does it? We're all connected to nature in that way, but we've been taught to forget it. There are big gaps now between what we do in our lives and what are the sources of the things that we use in our lives. So this is a great way to first start thinking about getting back to some of that intimacy. I can't think of a more intimate thing to do than to ingest something and use it as a food. How many times have you heard people say, hold the baby and say, oh, I could eat you up? Now, that's the ultimate love. I hope you don't eat babies up, but I think you know what I'm talking about. You just feel so enraptured by it all. And medicines fall into that too. And the medicines that are out in the world, in our forest, that was the original source of every medicine, you know? And you can say that about anything. That's the big difference between us now and the Cherokees long ago, is that we now depend upon this one concept that's part of everyone's life, and it's called stores. And think about it, if there were no stores, no roads, no cars, just forests, which this was, you know. You've seen so much cleared land and pastures in your life, it's easy to forget that this was the great eastern woodlands. And everything that was needed by a human to survive it was present in that forest. To me, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's why we survived it. So let's look at some of these things that can be useful to you. Now, there's not going to be a test at the end of this, but I will say this. If you want to use these ideas that I'm talking about, and these are all things that I have either used myself, or if I've not had a need for it, I've used with a student or some other person and been able to witness the results of it. So I don't like teaching things that are just regurgitating other people's ideas. You know, I like knowing what works. One of the reasons I love reading modern research in science. I want to see these things backed up by science, because then you've got a language you can use to explain to people. But your job in all this, if you want to use some of this, is you've got to be a good student about recognizing which plant is which. The worst mistake you could make would be to misidentify. And that happens all the time. I remember in the 1970s, America's #1 mycologist died from eating the wrong mushroom. Think about that. He was the most honored fungus scientist in the country. And mistakes happen every year. A lot of times it's with children, because they see something. I bet a lot of you know horse nettle, a thorny weed that grows in a pasture, and it grows that little orange fruit that looks like a miniature tomato. That's one of the #1 killers right there of children in accidents. I don't mean it happens a lot, but what I'm trying to get across to you is take very seriously the identification of plants, because you and I have lost all the instincts that our ancestors had. You know, I teach about Native Americans a lot, and I know that I'm known for having a great kind of reverence toward their reverence about nature, but we all come from those same kinds of roots. I don't have one drop of native blood in me. You know, I've tried, but I don't have it. And so, but I come, just like you do, from someone who carried a spear that he or she had shaped and had chipped the stone for the point and had lashed it on with cordage that had been made. We all come from that. And so there was a time when all of us had instincts. And any anthropologist will tell you this today, that paleo people were born into this world with all the knowledge I'm about to teach you tonight. It was just already there. That's hard to believe, isn't it? It sounds almost too fanciful. And if it does, ask yourself this: how do the wild animals do it? They know all about it. Take the wild out of an animal, like a dog, a cow, you remove some of that common sense. You've all seen purebred dogs. No offense to anyone, I love dogs, but aren't purebred dogs a little bit wacky, right? They're not balanced so much as a wild animal is. They don't behave like wild animals. When your dog rolls in something that you wish they had, that may be the wildest and most instinctive thing they've ever done right there. Anyway, please stop me. My name's Mark, and ask me a question or tell me a story you know about it. I always love starting with fire and talking about medicine, because so many medicines require a heating up process of some kind. And so I love to talk about the concept of fire. I'm just going to do that briefly. This is a beautifully made pyre by one of my students after a class on building a pyre. And you see all these little twigs right here that were used as kindling. And first of all, by the way, you see that little garage right there? That's where a flaming ball of tinder was parked after the fire-making process was done. I'm talking about creating fire with your hands. I'll show you that in just a minute. But all this kindling here, because I live in the mountains, every time I build a pyre, my #1 tree to go to is the white pine, because its lowest branches, if it's a sizable tree, are always dead. But unlike most trees, they keep holding onto those branches, and there you have nature's giving drying rack, of kindling. It's off the ground. It's exactly what you want. And it's full of a chemical called a terpene. Even when the wood is dead, the terpene remains in the wood, and it's highly flammable. So that little mound of kindling right there, if we didn't have the other pieces of wood in the way, it would make about a 2-foot flame. Just that little bit there, because it's so chemically flammable. This was the process. Nobody knows for certain, but this is probably how fires were first made, by spinning a vertical, straight, woody weed, a winter-dried weed. As long as it was strong enough to hold up to this kind of action, it would work. But here you've got to know what kind of tree you're using for the hearth. And this is the tinder here that is used to actually burst into a flame in the process. You can see the smoke starting to billow up there. The Cherokees and some other tribes had this wonderful poetic way of thinking about the trees that you could use to make fire. We've got about 130 species of trees around us here in the southeast. And of those, in my life's experiments, so far I've got about 28 trees with which you can make fire. And the rest of them probably can't be done. The limiting factor is body strength, just human body strength. For example, oak trees are not on the list. They're just too dense, hard of wood. But I've made fire with oak accidentally with a chainsaw. You know, you're creating sawdust, and you've got that extreme friction from that machine, and I've had a flame come up with that before. So it's just a matter of limitations. But I'm no chainsaw, so I can't make it with oak, and I've never met anybody who could. But here's that source of those beautiful pieces of kindling, the very tiny sub-branchlets of the dead lower limbs of the white pine. How to recognize white pine? All pine trees like to grow at some point on their trunk what's called a whorl, W-H-O-R-L. And that's where all the limbs at that level come out from one level. So if you look down on it from above, it might remind you of the spokes of a wheel at that, and the hub. You know, all the limbs are coming from that. But this tree makes nothing but whorls. Not technically every time, but just about. You can see them right there. There's one whorl. There's another. That's our only pine that does that in our part of the world. There are other pines that do that, but you're not going to find them in the southeast. And it's also our only pine that groups its needles together in groups of, anybody happen to know? I heard somebody say it, most of our pine trees are grouped the needles in 2s and 3s. And that means you've picked up a pine needle before, just holding one needle, and there are others attached to that same little sheath. That's called the fascicle, that little bark sheath that holds it together. This is our only one with 5 needles. So now you know 2 ways to definitely recognize it. Now there's a medicine here. And it's made from a part of the tree called the inner bark. And this is a piece of anatomy that I find that most people just don't know about. So get ready. You're going to learn about it. This is a branch of living white pine right here. And you can see I carved with my knife a long, thin rectangle. And I carved away the outer bark, which is the skin of the tree. That's to protect the tree. And now you see that layer that's curving up? I've just pulled up a little bit of it so you can show that it separates easily. And you can see there's a green layer. That green layer is 1 cell thick. And that's called the cambium. Have you heard that word before? The cambium is not the inner bark, which is that whole piece pulled up. It's that 1 cell thick layer of the inner bark. And I've seen so many books confuse readers about that. Many books call the entire inner bark layer the cambium. Not true. The cambium is that greenish layer. Now, what is the inner bark? What does it do for the tree? It's a very important part of the anatomy, and it relates to our circulatory system. Now, the tree is called, when it's standing, the trees were called by the Cherokees the standing people. Now, that's interesting to me because of the adjective, first of all, standing. And this is profound, I think. So many times I've read authors who say it's because they stand so tall. I firmly believe that it's because they stand in one place. It's a rare, rare thing for anything in wildlife to be able to do that. Think about the other part of wildlife, animals. What are they doing 99% of their lives, of their waking lives? They're doing one thing, and that's looking for food. Here we have a piece of wildlife that can make its own food. And that is the miracle of life on the planet Earth. And you and I cannot live without that. Because every bit of energy that you use, right now blinking your eye, or maybe this morning doing some push-ups, or lifting something, every bit of energy that you use comes from the sun. But you and I cannot receive it personally. We have to have middlemen, middlewomen, and that's the green plants. They do that for us. They are, in a sense, our agents in this formula. So we depend on them. And think about how we've removed ourselves from that knowledge. I know you already knew that, but think how we've removed ourselves from that. And when we go about putting up something new, it's a couple of bulldozers just raising an area, right? And then maybe we go back and plant a few token trees. The way we go about things now just shows that we're not connected intimately to these things. Okay, back to what this does. The tree sucks up nutrients and minerals from the earth by way of the water that it sucks up through it. It's a miraculous process of just lifting it up. The roots have these hairs, and the hairs make acid, and the acid dissolves whatever's around it in the dirt. And then the water allows the tree to suck up those resources and send them up the tree, and I'll bet nobody knows what part of the tree it goes up. This is the test. It's called the sapwood, and it's the next layer just past the inner bark. You can see sapwood right there, that bright strip on the limb. That's very porous. It's actually tubes that go up, and the sapwood will eventually become part of the heartwood. So it'll harden and be part of the skeletal system of the tree. But right now it's a circulatory system. So the materials go up, and then in the miracle part of the tree that makes food and takes energy out of light, I hope you'll think about that just for a moment. Everything you did today depended on this thing. You use the sun's energy all the time. So energy is taken by the leaves and it's put into a food that the leaf makes. Who could make food in here? Raise your hand. Good, nobody embarrassed themselves. We put things together nicely, but we don't make food. So then, once those materials are made, and there are lots of materials made by trees, some of it is food, some of it is medicine for itself, some of it is preservatives, and some of it is poisons to protect the plant. But it sends down by way of the inner bark. So there's your answer. The inner bark is the down elevator. Why does it go down? Because the roots have got to have all this. The roots have got to have it in order to grow and function. So it's a remarkable story. I didn't finish what I was going to tell you about the trees that make fire. What the Cherokees, the way they talked about that poetically. They said it this way. The white pine is one of the trees that in the ancient day swallowed fire. And if you know how to ask it, it will give fire back to you. What is the medicine here? Well, the typical dosage for anyone to use when using inner bark as a source of a medicine, just like this one, is to outline your little finger. So instead of a rule of thumb here, we've got a rule of pinky. That's how much inner bark you use. Now, you can see that this strip doesn't correlate to what I just said, because I do something even kinder. That's a good way to remember it, but what I do is half as wide as my pinky and twice as long. It's the exact same amount of surface area there, isn't it? And yet it does less damage to the limb. Here's another great thing. You can read in some of the old books, like by James Mooney, about Cherokee traditions and formulas and things that they did that were so distinct to their tribe. And one of the things they did when taking from a tree is they circled the tree a certain number of times, and then they would stop in the circle and approach it only from the south, no other direction. Now that just sounds like a little hocus pocus, doesn't it? But there's now an understandable reason for that. The south side of a tree gets the most sun over the year. You know what happens to the sun in the wintertime? It's actually what happens to us. The planet tilts and we don't get the direct sunshine that we did. The sun appears to be lower in the southern horizon. So everything that's can face the south is going to get some sun in the winter. So the south face of this tree would be the most bathed in sunlight, and sunlight is disinfecting, literally. Kills germs. So you're taking from the side of the tree that the sun is going to help take care of. Because one of the worst things you can do for a tree is to give it an entrance for some kind of pathogen to get in. And one of the worst, or several of the worst, are fungi. Now that doesn't mean fungi are the bad guys, because trees have to have certain fungi underground. You've been reading about this, I hope, and all that's being discovered about how trees communicate and how they share materials with one another through the fungi that join their roots from one tree to the other. It's pretty fascinating. If that interests you and you haven't read anything about it, let me throw out a book title for you. Finding the Mother Tree. Finding the Mother Tree. It's by a Canadian forester named Suzanne Simard. So you take this strip of bark and put it into a cup of water that you had just boiled. So in other words, you're steeping that section of bark. You're not actually boiling it. And 20 minutes later, you've got an expectorant. And that's the chemical, or let's call it a medicine, that can help you to loosen up phlegm from your bronchial tubes, which are infected at this point. And the bacteria cultures are living there in all that congested mucus. It's helping you to separate it from your bronchial tubes and to cough it up so that you can spit it out. You're getting rid of that invasion of bacteria that way. That's what an expectorant is for. All right, here's a great one. I hope it's going to brighten somebody up in this room today. Somebody in this room probably suffers from migraine headache. Right? Anybody? Okay, at least one, two. All right, I'm going to tell you something just phenomenal about the flowering dogwood tree. This is the dogwood that most people are very familiar with. It makes a blossom that is 4-part, look about that big. I can't say 4 petals because they're literally not petals. They're another part of the flower. The flower is actually the very small parts right in the center. You're probably familiar with the bark that looks very reptilian. Another way to recognize dogwoods is they are one of the handful of trees that we have that have opposite leaves. And in a certain percentage of the tree, opposite branches. That's a very small percentage of all of our trees. Only a handful of them have opposite leaves. Can you see how those 2 leaves grow opposite one another off the branch? Okay, and if we could go on up and look at the branches, sure, we'd see lots of exceptions to the rule, but we'd find some very definite branching like this too. Here's another little thing that can help you recognize the dogwood. This is a very common vein system in that we have, let's just look at this bottom right leaf. You see that it has that center vein that runs all the length of it right down the middle. That's called the midrib vein. And do you see the lateral veins that come off of it? Well, most leaves that have that configuration have the lateral veins just go right out and branch again maybe and then touch the margin of the leaf. Can you see what those do? They bend away from the margin of the leaf. That's going to help you to recognize this. And if you're real careful, you can take one of those leaves and just very slowly pop the midrib vein, and you'll find inside these little tiny strands of latex. It'll look like a spider silk to you. So you've got quite a few things you can look at there. The Cherokees call this the alligator tree because of the bark, and they made up a story that they told their children. And this story was designed to help the children remember what it's for. So here's the quick version of the story. Here's the Reader's Digest condensed version. The alligators came up from Okefenokee, fell in love with the rolling hills here, and then went on up to the mountains and fell even more in love with that. And they decided, we're going to stay here. We've spent our lives just looking at flat horizons down on the coastal plain. So they started to live up in the mountains, and first winter came along, and they could not handle it. It was just too cold. So they turned into trees, and they were able to survive it. Well, we know, of course, that's a story, but think about its theme. It's a story about the lowering of temperature, that's winter, and survival. That's the trees making it through the winter. And what we've known for centuries about this tree is the inner bark of this, exactly like you saw in the white pine. Using a branch only. Never do this on the trunk of a tree. That's too much damage. But you go out on one branch to take your sample off of there, and you're cutting that rectangle with your knife. And then once you've cut the rectangle, don't peel it off now because that outer bark is still on there. And then it would be very hard for you to remove it with a loose piece of bark. While it's on the branch, take your knife and very carefully skin away the outer bark and then peel it right up.
Now these are branches that you leave on the tree. You're not cutting the branch.
Right. No need to. And then I'm going to suggest to you that you use anything you can think of that will kind of glue over the wound, because we are now facing the death of dogwoods. And it's due to anthrax. This is not anything about terrorism. Remember the anthrax in letters that back in, when was that, about 2 decades ago? This is a natural anthrax that has hitchhiked with a fungus. It's in the air everywhere, and when it finds a wound in a dogwood tree, it will attack there, and it works just like the chestnut blight. It demolishes the inner bark. The tree can't live without that. The bark blisters, and the tree's dead. So cover it with something. It doesn't matter if it's Elmer's glue. Do something to cover it. Okay, so that will lower temperature for high fever. Now that may be not so impressive today because we've got things that do that pretty easily, but there was a time when that was an extremely important medicine. High fever for too long destroys brain cells, and there's no predicting of what that could do to a human. All kinds of bad results could come from that. So again, this is a matter of just dropping that piece of bark into an empty cup and pouring just boiled water into it. Wait 20 minutes. Drink it.
Like an 8 ounce or a 6 ounce?
A cup.
Oh, just a cup. Okay.
1 cup.
Okay.
Yeah. So that strip of bark is for 1 cup. The exact same tea cures a migraine in 45 minutes. I know that's hard to believe. I've never had a migraine, but I've talked to plenty of people who have, and I know how severe it can be. And everyone I've talked to said they've never been able to get a prescription of anything that helped them. I've now had this happen 11 times at my school. A student comes to me and says, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to go home. I've got a migraine coming on." Every time we've made up the dogwood tea, person goes back and lies down for 45 minutes. in 11 cases, they're back in class with no symptoms. To me, that's very impressive. I've never seen it fail. But it's only the flowering dogwood, not the other dogwoods. They don't seem to work for some reason. The active ingredient here is called cornic acid. It's called that because in Latin, the word cornus means horn, as in an animal's horn. You know how hard that material is. And this is one of our very hardest woods that we have. So cornic acid, if you look at it on paper, if you had a chemist look at it on paper, seeing the molecular structure, and you compared it to, say, salicylic acid, which is the root of aspirin, you'd see a lot of similarities in the two. But they are different. And the salicylic acid, I'll bet you've heard before, reading in a book somewhere, chew on the branches of a willow twig and it'll cure a headache. You know what the book doesn't tell you? It takes 8 hours for salicylic acid to be assimilated by the human body. And that's why scientists tweaked it. So instead of salicylic acid, it's acetyl salicylic acid, and that works fast. So the aspirin was a great new advance in medicine. But here's one for you for the migraine. This is even more impressive, I think. Anyone have any questions about that? Okay.
Does this need to be done like immediately after you take the inner bark out, or can it be preserved?
That's a great question, and usually when I'm asked that, I have to say I don't know, because I go about this from the survival skills direction of where when the situation calls for I need this, then I go to it and get it. So I'm not an herbalist. I don't have stores of things, inside my home. But I think of the forest as the pharmacy. But I do happen to know about this one. And it's only because of history. During the Civil War, everybody in the South was asked to go out, and who was home, to go out and cut up inner bark of dogwood and send it to New Orleans, to a big factory where it was just dried. And then it was dispensed out to the different places where it was needed for the military forces. Because we had these rampaging epidemics, during the Civil War of typhus, typhoid, and other problems, the infection of crude medical work, all the amputations, lots of high fevers, and big demand for it. And the U.S. military, even today, has used an import for that, quinine. We don't have quinine here. That's a tropical plant. So any time in the history of America, whenever we have had too much demand for fever reducers, the government starts using dogwood bark. So both sides in the Civil War use that.
Our daughter used to have febrile seizures as a baby. In other words, her high fever, she had like 104.7. What do you feel about that and children?
I don't know.
Okay.
I would hate to tell you wrong on that.
Yeah. I mean, she's a grown woman.
So I'll just say I've not had the experience of using it with children. They've all been adults, so I better just leave it at that.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yes, sir.
Well, was that cornic acid, was that to treat the migraines or to treat the expectorant?
The expectorant was from the white pine, and this one was for both fever reducing and for the migraine.
Oh, yeah,
The same medicine for both of those maladies. This is probably my most used medicine, because one of the most common accidents that happens at my school would be a burn. People working around fire. We use fire a lot for our crafts and cooking and whatever. And a lot of times there are people who arrive for a class who may not have much experience in outdoor skills, and they're just not used to the care you have to take around the fire. For example, I always think about this young man. He was in his early 20s, and he was a very bright fellow. He was doing really well in the class. And while cooking his meal that night, he simply forgot. And he reached out to pick up his saucepan with a metal handle without a pad, which he does all the time at home, you know. That's an example. I'm not criticizing him, but he's showing us a great example of all of us. That's part of that separation thing, of not being connected to the real thing. The stove is like a magician, you know, and we just don't realize that because we use it all the time. But he burned his hand very badly, and we made up this medicine that I'm about to describe to you. And as soon as his hand went into the little container, he was almost in tears. I could see he was trying to hold it back. But he just broke into this big smile. Because the medicine that I'm about to describe to you does three things for you. It removes the pain immediately. It also stimulates the living tissue at the edge, the periphery of the burn, the living tissue. It stimulates it to make new tissue. So it's really bulking up or beefing up the regeneration, the healing. And the last thing that it does is when he took his hand out of there and the water evaporated, it left a film over his burned wound to protect him from secondary infection. It's very easy to make. Take any container that will hold water, doesn't matter the size of it, fill it with green red maple leaves. I mean, this could be a helmet, you know, or this could be a can, tin can. Heat up some water by itself in there, in some container, and then pour it over the container of leaves. Now, once you pour hot water on green leaves, you should not expect anything to happen, because the chemicals inside of green leaves are very wet, aren't they? Green leaves are full of water. The chemicals are perfectly content to be there. They have no reason to want to go out into the water that you've poured in. In other words, there's no reason for it to diffuse. But you put dried leaves in, you've seen that work with tea leaves, right? Tea bags. You see it leach out quickly, don't you? The chemicals are just wanting to get out there, if I can use that verb. I know I'm giving chemicals a little animation here. But that's what the law of diffusion is all about. And that's one of those miracles on the planet, that diffusion works that way. But with green leaves, you have to make it happen. You need a blunt tool, and you've got to crush, 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 crush until that water has cooled. Because you never want to put anything hot on a burn. And once it's cooled, if you've been dedicated to the crushing, you have gotten enough of the chemicals into that water that you can now use the liquid itself as your medicine. And you can pour it right onto an area, or use a cloth and pack it on there, or submerge it like my friend did in the class. And it brings you relief so fast that it's just hard to believe. I've got a great story to tell you about it, because it proves how wonderfully effective it is. I had a physician in one of my classes. He was about a 60-something-year-old gentleman. And after the class was over, this was a class on plants and medicines, he came to me and told me about a patient of his, a man who had leaned on some hot machinery by accident and burned his chest terribly. The wound was about the size of a soccer ball. And the doctor had been working on him for months, applying medicines to him, and he'd gotten the wound, which was festering, to reduce to the size of a softball, and then it just stopped. It wouldn't reduce anymore. So he said, I'm going to try the maple on him. And I said, great, but you've got to tell me the results of it. He called me 9 days later, and he said, the wound is gone. Wow. So what this man did was, the doctor made the material for him. He crushed up the leaves, and he gave it to this man to keep in a jar in the refrigerator. And who knows how long that would last him? I don't know, but I bet it would last you a while. But every day, this man took time to put a rag in there and rinse it out, wring it out a little bit. He lay down and put it on his chest and just lie there for 20 minutes or so. And then he'd do that again in the afternoon, then do it again at night. 9 days later, whoosh, gone.
Wow. How would you compare that to aloe?
Aloe is wonderful, but I can't find it out in the woods.
You're right.
If you were to make
need to.
that and for a burn and stored it in the fridge, would you strain the leaves out? And
Don't need to. Don't need to, but you could. You know, the leaves can be, since you're crushing them up, they can actually become a paste that serves as kind of a bandage for you too, in addition to the film that it would leave. The maples are one of those rare trees that have opposite leaves. That's on the short list, so if ever you find an unknown tree you're not sure about and you see it's got opposite leaves, you know, it's that short list. So far we've gone over dogwoods. That's all the dogwoods except for the one called alternate leaf dogwood. You know, it's so odd that they named it that. And so all the maples have opposite leaves, and there are lots of maples. Red maple is the only one that I've verified this works with. Could work with other maples. Yes, sir.
Now that red maple, that's a red stem maple?
The red stalk. Yeah. The difference between a stem and a stalk. I'm trying to cure the world of this one. This is one that's just commonly mistaken. A stem is a trunk of a plant, no matter what it is, an herb. You know, even if it's a brown-eyed Susan, it's the main middle structure of the plant that comes up to branch. Okay, a stalk is an appendage that attaches something to the plant. It could attach to the stem, or it could attach to a branch. But here are the different stalks you have: leaf stalks, flower stalks, and once the flower has done its thing, it becomes a fruit stalk, right? That's it. But yeah, that's the one with the red stalks, leaf stalks. Great native word, sassafras. It means green twig. If you look at sassafras even in the winter, look at some of its last year's branches, and you'll see that there's still a beautiful green color. For centuries and centuries, pioneers right here used sassafras root tea as a spring tonic. If you'd gone back into time and asked somebody, why are you drinking that tea right now? That person would have said, probably, well, we've been doing it a long time and it keeps us healthy. That's about all they knew. Of course, they learned it from the native people. But now we know what it does. Safrole is one of the chemicals inside of sassafras. Safrole. We know now that it's carcinogenic, mildly. It's in black pepper. Every one of us has had it. It's all about moderation. You know, nobody loads up on black pepper, I hope, as a serving for a meal. But because it is carcinogenic, the presence of that chemical in the root tea that you drink alarms your immune system and literally strengthens it. It's like a country, you know, scaring another country and they start building up an arms supply and training people. It's just getting your immune system tough. And it's been proven that people who do boost their immune systems in the spring have far less problems with things like hay fever, allergic things that happen throughout the summer. So this has been known for a long time. The way that you might have experienced sassafras before, and maybe you didn't even know you were getting it, if you've ever eaten that Cajun food called gumbo filet, that's the gumbo, the leaves. If you eat the very young leaves of sassafras, which is perfectly fine to do, the very young leaves, about that long, it will taste, believe it or not, like Fruit Loops cereal. It's a unique flavor, but that's what it is. You know, kids told me that for a long time, and then finally I had to try Fruit Loops, and that was it. But now we know something else about sassafras, and this one makes it maybe number one on my list of all the medicines because it can save your life. And I've experienced this one myself with a little bad episode that I had one time, but let me tell you how it works. Sassafras root tea to make is very easy. You don't have to do any kind of measuring at all. It doesn't matter what size your container is that you're heating up water. But once you've heated it up, say to boiling, then you can pour that into another container like a glass, put a little piece of sassafras root in there that you have scored with a knife like this, just to put slits in it. So let's say, let's talk about maybe the bottom ½ inch of a long carrot. Okay, that little tip in, about that much root. It doesn't matter because we're going by color on this. When you drop that in, you wait until you can see that the pink color has spread throughout. And then you can take your root out because this medicine is done. That's ready to be drunk. And guess what it does? Yeah, it boosts your immune system, but it does this also. And this is a good and a bad thing that we'll talk about. It kills all the bacteria in your gut. All of it. You know that we have good bacteria that we need, but sometimes you have to go drastic and kill the pathogens that have gotten into you from bad food or bad water and have made you so sick that you are no longer able to function. And you're going to have dysentery to the highest degree. It's going to dehydrate you. It's very dangerous. It's a good formula for dying, really, and a very painful death. So if you kill all the bacteria in you, you kill those bad ones. That's the goal. You'll build back up good bacteria, especially if you're living outside doing wilderness things, you know, with your hands always dirty. That happens pretty quickly.
How do you get the root?
Well, you dig for it.
Okay.
And all sassafras trees are connected to others. Their main way, they do make flowers and fruit and go to seed, of course, but the main way of reproducing is the asexual way, which I know sounds like no fun, but is by sending rhizomes out. Underground stems is what they are. If you dug one up, you'd think you were looking at a root. But they make other roots as well that spread through. Just dig around a sassafras tree and you'll recognize it by its many different leaf shapes. You know, it's got the two-thumbed mitten, it's got the football shape, and then it's got the one-thumbed mitten. But it's got about 5 other shapes too. It has mittens with hitchhiking thumbs on them like that too. So a lot of different, about 7 or 8 different shapes there, but mainly those first 3 that I mentioned. And the tricky thing is when a sassafras tree gets very old, it stops making the variety of leaves and just makes the football shape. So, and they're way up high on a big tree. It can really keep you going for a while trying to figure out what it is. But when you know you found one, start digging and go for a little auxiliary root. You know, don't do a major stress to the tree. Look for some side branching rootlet and just take a little piece of it. Tastes like root beer.
Oh, there you go.
And you know, every child that I've ever let taste this, just for the experience of it, and when they say that, you know, there's this moment of, wait a minute, root beer. You know, they never thought about that before. Just like yesterday I was telling Susan, palm olive soap. It's palm and olive. Oh! You know, as a kid I always called it palm olive. That's what I thought it was, palm olive. Okay, the Surgeon General named this, they banned this back in I guess it was the 80s. They were testing everything to see what was carcinogenic. And that included the little crusty part of a hamburger too, you know. So a lot of it got publicity, a lot of it did not. But sassafras took a hit and it was outlawed. You couldn't buy it in an herb store anymore. And now we know how ridiculous it was because the testers separated the chemicals and took only the safrole. So there is not a balanced chemical at all. And they injected into a laboratory rat, and here's the word, until the rat made tumors. Right. And none of us would ever be able to ingest that much, you know, to create something like that. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. Any herbalist today will tell you that, to not be afraid of using that tea. The downside is that it does kill your bacteria gut. So after you do that, it's probiotic time. Lots of yogurt.
Even just with a tea with the leaves, or is that something different?
You know, I'm not talking about a tea with the leaves, just with the root. Tea with the root. Yeah. The only use of the leaves that I know of is you gather them in high summer when they're very mature, and you bundle them together to make a little cluster and tack them up in a doorway in your home. That lets them dry without getting sunlight. And then you've got dried leaves, and you can crumble that into something as a gumbo. It'll thicken up and give a great taste to whatever you're cooking. Next time you make a soup, next summer, try that. And watch what happens not only to the consistency, but also to the taste of the soup. Pipsissewa, another great native word. You can find this today out in the woods. It's an evergreen. It loves to grow its leaves in whorls, though not every single time, but this is what it wants to do. Layers of whorls of leaves. Has a beautiful pure white flower, and once it goes to fruit, it nods over. Grows low to the ground, maybe this high, and it usually grows in colonies. So when you are in need of this, you would just take 2 leaves from this little cluster here, and then go find another colony, take 2 leaves from there, and so on. This is the mindful way. Let's call it the Cherokee way to do it. It's thinking ahead. You know the word myopia? That's us. That's America. Not looking ahead and planning, for what could happen down the future. Let's just do it now. Let's eat it all up now. Let's burn it all up now. The native people had this wonderful mindset of taking care of what was around them, because didn't it make sense? And it might not make sense to one of us to go out in the woods and why not just take all these? Who cares? Well, this is a medicine that works so beautifully for dissolving stones in the body. And it works well. I've never had a stone, but I've gone through this process with somebody who did have stones. He was 47 when I met him. He had made stones since he was 10 years old. He made a stone every 2 months of his life.
Wow.
He kept his stones as trophies. This is how this all started. I walked in his house. I had to be the world expert on knowing when a stone was forming in the body. Wouldn't you guess? And when he felt that sensation, he made the tea. And when you're talking about making a tea with leaves, when it's dried leaves, it's 1 teaspoon leveled out of dried leaf material. If it's green leaves, how do you measure teaspoons of green leaves? You got to cut them up in the smallest little pieces you can and do 2 teaspoons. You got to do twice as many with the green. And guess what else you got to do with the green?
Crush it.
Yes, thank you. You got to work. Got to crush, crush, crush. Well, this guy, next time he had a stone coming on, he did this morning, evening, 1 cup in the morning, 1 cup in the evening. Next day, same thing, no stone. Next time it happened, same thing, no stone. No more stones since then.
2 leaves and then 2.
I'm just saying 2 leaves to be mindful of the plants.
Right, exactly.
And you get a bunch of them, tie them together,
Oh, tie them together, okay.
tack it up. You just have a nice little Christmas decoration up there
Yeah,
during any time of the year.
okay.
So the potency on a medicine, if you're using it, whether it's a wet leaf or whether it's dry leaf, it's the same potency?
Well, those chemicals don't change, but their availability do, from dryness versus wetness. When the plant is dry, sometimes chemicals are lost in the drying process, okay? But many of the chemicals are intact in the leaf material when they're drying, and they're still there when it's dried. And when you use the dried, it's 1 teaspoon. When you use the green, it's 2, because you're just not going to get all the chemicals out of there, even though you're crushing it. Okay? Yes, sir.
Doesn't this plant, or does this plant go by another name, wintergreen?
Yeah, it does, but there's not any wintergreen oil in it.
No.
And the reason it's called that is there's another plant whose name is also wintergreen. This is the problem with common names of plants. Of course, they all have their separate Latin names, which nobody here would want to learn. But There's another wintergreen plant that grows a little farther north from us in North Georgia. And it does have wintergreen oil in it, just like our black birches do. You could smell it, the wintergreen oil. But you could take any part of this plant and crush it up and try to find wintergreen smell. You just won't. It's not there.
That work for gallstones as well as kidney stones?
Yeah,
Okay.
all stones. Mm-hmm.
And it's abundant around here?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've ever, of course, I haven't walked in.
Okay, remember, it's only about this tall, and right now the leaves are covering it up. It's out there right now. If you go for a walk tomorrow, well, it's probably going to be raining still. Isn't it? Next time you can,
So go to Red Top, go hiking.
just go walking through the woods, and you're going to see it.
This weekend, we actually went, and I had, she got a little ahead of me, and I was just taking moseying on up, and I was taking pictures of it all. I was like, look at all the, we call it striped wintergreen.
That's another name
And
for
I
it.
hadn't heard this name, and she told me that it might.
This name means breaks apart the stone.
Wow.
Pip Sissawa.
There you go. It's not very big. It's only as
Okay, this will be the last plant we talk about just because I'm running out of time. Jewelweed is the one plant that I think everyone should know because this can bring you comfort. And that's a big deal in my book because I've worked with children a lot. And when you take children out into the woods who've not experienced the woods before, one of your hurdles is the comfort thing. Especially if they encounter something that's not comfortable, like a yellow jacket sting. There are a lot of things that can cause discomfort, and all the things that itch, which can be horrible. How many of you have real special feelings toward chiggers? Some people aren't bothered by chiggers. I mean, they still get bitten by them. And you know that there's a myth about chiggers. They do not crawl under your skin. What they do is they bite you, and they insert some chemical in you so that the bite doesn't scab over right away. And they suck some of your blood, which they need for their fertilization process. But it's that chemical they put into you that gets your immune system just riled up like crazy and sends the cavalry after that. The white blood cells in the lymph go to that area and create the problem. Poison ivy works the same way. It's our immune system that causes the bumps and the itching. This plant, which is our wild impatiens, will stop the itching immediately. A very succulent stem. In the summertime, you can just crush it easily, and you'll get a lot of the juice right out of the stem. Later in the summer, it starts getting woody and spindly. It's a lot harder to get the chemical out of. Now it's gone, but it's going to be back in the spring. And you need to learn this one. It loves to grow in a place that's got some shade and light. It needs to be fairly close to a good water source. So low ground, edge of a meadow, something like that. Maybe if your creek's wide enough to get some sunlight, the banks of a creek, good place, and you might find a big bed of this somewhere that's really beautiful. It can grow about this tall, but generally you see it maybe growing about this tall. And every part of it has the medicine in it. It works like cortisone, but it doesn't have the downside that cortisone has. Cortisone stresses out the adrenals. This does not. This is only used topically, so you crush it up. You could use a